Hello, everybody. This is Chris McMeeking here, native mobile accessibility expert here, also a software architect. I develop and I manage our native mobile offerings, including a test and things like that. But today, I'm here to talk to you about Talkback, Android's screen reader assistive technology. One of the things that I will say is I want to at the end set aside time for questions. So if you have any questions, I hope to leave about 15 to 25 minutes at the end. So if you have questions come up or anything that you're curious about, please keep that in mind, and we will have time for just some discussion towards the end of this presentation. But with that, let's go. So overview. First, I'm going to do a simple introduction to Talkback for those of you on the call that maybe have just a really introduction level knowledge of Talkback. I'm going to show you what it does and talk about its intended audience and how all of the various features work, some of the cool settings that we have available. Then I'm going to go through how various users with various disabilities interact with Talkback. There's actually a few different categories of disabilities that people that come to mind and that I've seen interact with Talkback. Non-sighted and partially sighted users are obviously Talkback's primary audience, but we also need to see how physically handicapped individuals use with Talkback. And I'm going to do my best to keep this in a user-oriented way. One of the things that I think particularly the development and content creation community loses sight of, no pun intended, but that they lose sight of is the audience that we're looking for and the problems that Talkback users really have when using applications, and that you get into so much over engineering of a solution, and you put you project your difficulty in using Talkback onto Talkback users, which is different, right? A Talkback user is very comfortable with Talkback, and so you don't want to, as you're building content, project your difficulties using content onto the consumers of Talkback and the difficulties that they actually have using Talkback. Another thing that I want to do is dig into some advanced Talkback features, and then towards the end, depending on how much time we have used up, I may go into how developers provide information for Talkback, how to test for Talkback, and talk about easiest path to full coverage, or I may just open it up for questions. We'll see where we're at. Another thing I want to say is that most of this presentation is going to be within an emulator actually interacting with Talkback. I'm not going to do a whole lot of PowerPoint presenting to you. So just keep in mind that most of this time is going to be spent interacting with Talkback. So what is Talkback? Talkback is Android's primary screen reader assistive technologies. The interesting thing about the Android operating system is it is possible to have third-party screen readers and third-party assistive technologies. There are actually a couple other assistive technologies that I would consider screen readers on the market. In fact, Google actually maintains a similar technology, Select-to-Speak, that in itself is a screen reader. But Android Talkback is the primary screen reader assistive technology. It's actually one of the most popular screen readers in the world by numbers. When you look at the overall number of Android devices as well as Chrome OS devices, Talkback is a very, very popular screen reader. It gives users a different view into an application. So Talkback's primary use case, primary role is to give users a different view into application content, to provide textual descriptions of highlighted views, and to modify the way users interact with the screen. And so what that means is that as you're interacting with Talkback, usually when a content creator or developer thinks of a screen reader on a desktop, for example, you would normally think of that as someone sitting at their keyboard and using the keyboard to drive some type of focus indication around the screen. And the interesting thing about Talkback and mobile screen readers in general is they actually have to solve two problems. They have to solve A, the idea of how do you share content, and B, they also have the problem of how does a user want to interact with this device, right? You have the screen and this touchscreen device that does not have a keyboard attached to it all the time. And so we do have to consider, A, how do users use keyboards with Talkback, but we also primarily have to consider what do users do that do not have a keyboard or hardware device attached to it. And so in the Android ecosystem, you end up in this scenario where you have to consider 3 or 4 different use cases: someone that has a purely touchscreen device, someone that has a trackball device, and someone that may have a USB or external keyboard attached to it, because all of those are going to drive the Talkback user experience. And oddly enough, Talkback does not actually capture keyboard events, and this becomes really interesting when we're talking about how do keyboards interact with Talkback, how do trackballs interact with Talkback, what is it that's actually going on, as compared to the normal Talkback workflow, which is to actually be touching the device and swiping right or swiping left to do things that we would normally associate with the tab or shift tab key events on a keyboard. I said I was going to keep this when I get into the demos. I'm going to spend a lot of time doing demos and a lot of time on devices. And when I do that, I want to keep that user oriented. And so the first user that we're going to talk about, Talkback, that's funny. The first user that we are going to talk about is purely non-sighted users, the very standard use case, someone who is otherwise perfectly mentally capable, perfectly physically capable. They have just lost their sight. And so they can hear everything, everything's fine, but they have no sight. This user is going to tend to rely on a feature of Talkback called Touch to Explore, and we'll also use swipe navigation. So that's going to be the 2 primary things. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, kind of give you a general overview of Talkback, and then talk about the different features of Talkback and how Talkback facilitates non-sighted users. So let me, I opened up Zoom chat in the background. Let me bring up my emulator. And so what I have here, this is an emulator. Now the thing to note about emulators is that basically everything that I do with my mouse, and I will try to annotate this as best as I can, but everything that I do with my mouse is going to be identical to the things that you do with your finger on a normal device. Emulators in Android work exactly like normal devices. And so there's really no difference. The difference is my mouse pointer is my finger. And actually, my keyboard, and the reason I'm using this is my physical keyboard is going to act as an external Bluetooth keyboard or a keyboard that where some of the physical devices. I don't even know if many of these exist anymore, but some of the devices have the physical keyboard available, or trackball. And actually, the trackball and the arrow keys and the different arrow pads, my keyboard and arrow keys will act as those as well. And so notice here what's happening is as I point at items on screen, you have this little toast message pop up, right? And so what happens is the screen, this toast message that pops up is the announcement that Talkback would be sharing, right? And so I'm going to click on phone here, and it says phone, actions, shortcuts, remove item, tap to activate, tap and hold to long press, right? And so I'm tapping around, and now what I'm going to start doing is, instead of selecting these intentionally, I'm going to start swiping across the screen, right? And so now I can swipe across screen. As I'm clicking, I'm basically with my mouse here, I'm clicking and holding. And what I'm doing is I'm focusing things one at a time. If I swipe left, it's going back, reverse through the order of items. If I swipe forward, and the easiest way to talk about this and how I will refer to this from now on is I'll either say swipe right, swipe left, which is going to be go to the next item, go to the latest item, or sometimes you'll hear me refer to it as the tab action, right? And basically what we're doing is we're linearly navigating through elements on screen. And so what's happening is we're starting, so let's say that I have focus on this, accessibility focus on this thing up here, Tuesday, September 18th. And let's say that I want to activate my calculator here, right? So I want to go to the calculator. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to swipe right, and it's going to announce calculator, actions, shortcut, remove, move item, tap to activate, tap and hold to long press. And so it's just explained to me the different actions that I can do. Tap and hold to long press, tap to activate. And so let's say that I want to activate this thing. What's going to happen is I am going to double click anywhere on my screen, right? So as a non-sighted user, I'm not necessarily going to know where this element is. I have just focused it. So this element could be up here, could be over here, could be down here. It doesn't matter where this element is. I am going to double tap on my screen, and now I have activated my calculator, right? And so now what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to start swiping right, and notice as I swipe right, this green rectangle is bopping around the screen. And it's giving me access to the elements on the calculator. Now, what I want to talk about is how are we going to use this to do interesting things, right? Let's do some type of example. So let's go through and enter some type of calculation, right? So as a blind user, there's various bits of information that I now need from this calculator app, and I'm going to start understanding where those pieces of information are the more I use this. But as I enter this, and let's take a look at this information here, I see that the first thing I come across is this results display, right? And I can do some things with it. Tap and hold to long press. Who knows what tapping and holding to long press is going to do? But I don't really have a clear sense of what's going on in this application yet. So I come down here, no result. All right, no result. That's given me at least a little bit of context into what's going on, but I still haven't discovered the meat of the application yet. And so now when I swipe right, numbers and basic operations. Okay, so I've come across really the first super useful, as a blind user, the first super useful information on this page. I have this big focus thing here, and it says numbers and basic operations. All right, so I'm to the content that I need. Now let's go in and let's figure out, okay, how can we do a mathematical calculation with this? And so we see here, I have 55 already entered. So the first thing that I want to do, if I hypothetically want to multiply and find the square root of, or let's do 25 squared, right? Let's do 25 times 25. I'm going to have to delete this. I found the delete button. I'm going to double click, cleared. Now I'm going to swipe left to go backwards. I'm going to find, okay, so I'm point button, 3 button, 2 button. All right, there we go, 2. So I'm going to activate that. 1, 6. Now notice this calculator is kind of laid out in an unideal way for a blind user, right? It's not a big deal, but our navigation order back through these numbers here is 3, 2, 1, 6, 5, 4, 9, 8, 7. Not ideal, just something I wanted to point out, right? Let's go. Oops, that was my mistake. I didn't swipe. I clicked and held instead. All right, so I do that. I'm going to double tap 25. All right, so now let's swipe forward. Swipe forward. We're swiping forward. Times. Let's go left, 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 left. 2. Oops, that was my mistake. I clicked and held instead of double clicked again. 2. And 5, and now we have to swipe forward and find the equal sign. All right, we did it. 625, and notice down at the bottom here, 625 was announced when I did that. So what it did was I did the 25 times 25 operation. I clicked equals, and then it came up and it said 625. It gave me my results. I can also swipe left through all of this and be like, okay, where is my result? And boom, 625, it's sharing my result, it's focusing. This is how a blind user gets information from Talkback. And notice that there were some things about this experience that were a little frustrating that we could have done in a little more ideal way. This application probably could have been laid out a little better. If we had some better navigation landmarks, maybe we could find some things a little better. But in general, that was a pretty reasonable experience. We had 625 called out. This is how blind people get information from an application. This is how they would interact with this calculator. And there are some things that they could do to speed up that operation, which I'll show you a little bit when I talk about partially sighted users, but this is in general the way a blind person gets information from Talkback. So now let's go forward and talk about how the partially sighted use Talkback. And when I say partially sighted, I say that hesitantly. The features that I'm going to talk about here are more aligned with the way a partially sighted user would use Talkback, but that doesn't keep them, if you have a well-designed application, from being applicable to blind users as well. And I'll show you what that means as a use. But as we're using Talkback in this demo, what I want you to keep in mind is the idea of a partially sighted someone who can maybe they can see well, but they're very dyslexic, or maybe they can see kind of general shapes, but they have a difficult time actually making out characters and reading content and things like that. So they can see shapes on the screen, they can see blurs, but that's really it. And we can't make the content big enough for them to be able to read it. And so what's going to happen here is you'll see they're almost always going to use touch to explore. And that's a new thing that I'm going to throw at you, the idea of touch to explore. And what that means is notice when I was using Talkback before, if I didn't do that really purposeful swipe across the screen, how the green Talkback focus indicator would kind of jump around and go straight to the thing that I clicked. What's happening is if you do this kind of click and drag motion slowly across the screen, Talkback will focus the things underneath your finger, and they will get read out. And this actually is the alternative assistive technology that's kind of dedicated to doing things like this is Select to Speak. But basically, what's going to happen, and let's go ahead and do the demo. So see here we have this 625, and let's go back and let's clear this out, right? And I'm actually already doing it if you're paying attention here. And so let's do that same operation from the point of view of a partially sighted user interacting with Talkback, right? And actually, as a developer, this is probably going to be the primary way that you interact with Talkback yourself, because it's much faster than doing swipes across the screen. And as you're testing content, there really is no reason to slow yourself down doing those swipes across the screen. You might as well jump around and go exactly where you need, because you are perfectly capable. And then what you do at the end is go through and make sure that there aren't any navigation things. And so really that swipe, that fully blind swiping across the screen methodology is really only useful for testing at the end when you're actually testing the navigational structure of your application. There's no reason not to do this in your own testing when you're testing the actual descriptions of things in your application. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same operation as a partially sighted user. And notice what happens is when I do, I'm dragging my finger around here. And as I'm dragging my mouse around, we are focusing and speaking these things out one at a time, right? So if I start at the top, I go radian mode, no formula, no result, 8, oops, I flipped over to 7, 4 button, 5, 2. Okay, so 2 button, right? So I explored to the 2 button, I double click, I remember that this button here in the middle is the 5. I know that this panel over here is my controls. I can kind of see that enough, right? And I kind of make that assumption, right? This is how every other standard calculator in the world is built. So I come over here, times, I remember where the 2 is, I click, I drag to it, 2 comma button, great, 2, I click and drag, 5, I go down. I probably, as someone who struggles to see, I probably explore these controls a little bit, trying to find the equal sign in here. And maybe it does kind of take me a while to find the equal sign in this application, right? So I come here and I'm like, oh, wait, the control that I want isn't there. And then I end up swiping anyway. Oh, look, there's my equals button. Found it, right? Equals. And what happens, right? So I'm selling this as a feature for partially sighted users, mostly to get you in the habit of thinking in a user-centric way. This is actually very applicable for blind users as well. This isn't confined to something that partially sighted users use, this idea of touch to explore. And what I mean by that is, as a blind user, you will tend to get used to the structure of the application, and used to the idea of where things are. Maybe you do that thing where I was accidentally clicked the 9 back when I was doing the demo, and that 9 showed up, right? Maybe you accidentally do that a few times, and even as a blind user, become used to the fact that, hey, there is a number pad here, right? So instead of swiping back through my controls or getting stuck up in here the results, I'll come here, I'll tap the middle of the screen, I'll find my 5, and then I will go to it, right? So let's do this kind of the way a blind user may interact with this as they're used to the application, right? Think a power user used to your application. They're going to know that there's a number pad here, right? And so what's going to happen is they're going to come in and they're just going to kind of put focus, oh, hey, there's my number pad, yay. They swipe through, they come here, 2, they swipe back, 5, and they're like, oh, I want multiply now, so I'm going to go over here, select my controls, I swipe forward, multiply, put focus back on the number, right? And I'm kind of doing this combination of touch to explore and swiping forward and backward in order to really kind of fluidly navigate through these. And the reason I'm able to do this is because this app is simple. These touch targets are large and grouped well, right? I have this big kind of control area where there are numbers here. And this is a very simple application to navigate around, right? And so it's not necessarily something that's possible to think about in every form of application if your tables get smaller with smaller elements in them, but it is something to think about, like, hey, how can I convey structure and meaning in order to communicate information more fluidly to a talkback user? And there's actually a few different things we can do and think about within that realm, right? One of the other things that I want to show you, and so this is interesting. This calculator example is interesting, and I like it because we have significant groups of controls that take up significant portions of the screen, right? A blind user, partially sighted user, they can discover that this is a number pad, they can discover that this is the controls area, and they can discover that this is results. That's something that they're going to be able to do easily, right? Let's talk about a more complicated example, which is like the settings screen, right? Let's look at some cool things we can do with settings information. So let's go in here. Let's look at the Android settings thing. And so in the Android settings application, there's actually some things where they do things really well for people with disabilities, and there's some parts where they do things poorly. And so let's talk about different things we can do with information. So notice here that as I'm poking around Talkback, these buttons are really big, right? This is cool. We have these awesomely large buttons, and they take up the entire width of the screen. So as a blind user, as a partially sighted user, or a completely blind user, touch to explore, this idea of dragging up and down, is going to be a really convenient way to discover information regardless, because I can discover everything just by dragging my finger down this application, right? This is good. When we go in here, go to Talkback, notice here that my use service, we don't have this idea of one big focusable target here, right? And so this switch here, the switch that turns Talkback off, is going to be all but undiscoverable for a blind user trying to use touch to explore on this. They are going to be forced to do this swipe right, swipe left navigation. Is that the end of the world? No. Both of these are accessible. One of them is a really awesome user experience. I can click, I can drag up, I can find things. The other one is just, it's got that little bit of stuff lacking. There is not a significant amount of information shared between these two buttons. There's no reason this whole cell can't be the action and the information for use service. Yes, Talkback is on. Use service, no, Talkback is not on. There's no reason that this cell can't be all of that. And so it's just another layer of usability for both partially sighted and blind individuals. All right. So before I go on, I want to talk about some of the advanced features of Talkback, because we're going to get into, after this, an interesting discussion about focus and accessibility focus and how confusing that can get. But first, let's talk about some of the advanced Talkback features. So one of the things that Talkback does and the way it behaves is it captures this screen, right? The difference between Talkback and mobile screen readers versus desktop screen readers is we have access to this screen and some gestures that you can perform, right? And the two primary Talkback users, non-sighted, partially sighted, are both perfectly capable of doing gestures, as long as those gestures are simple, right? Telling a blind person to draw a curly Q or sign their name, maybe not meaningful, but telling a blind person to, for example, swipe up or down, right or left, or even do interesting combinations of those things, that is perfectly plausible. And so what I'm going to do is let's dig into the Talkback. Let's go into the settings menu. And let's take a look at all of the different configurations we can have. So one of the things that we have is verbosity, whether or not to speak usage hints. So as a developer, it's interesting to know that Talkback users can turn off usage hints. Speak list and grid information, collection information, how many elements are in this list, what number of element am I, so on and so forth. Speak element type, is it a button, is it a switch, and you can turn this on or off. This is probably something that most blind users, with the exception of maybe usage hints and list and grid information, this is something that blind users are probably going to leave all of these on. They want as much information as possible. But a partially sighted user probably doesn't need information about what type of the control is, because they really only need the help of reading the words on the screen, right? So you can come and you can change this. And the big thing here is to be cognizant of this exists, particularly as a developer, that people can go in and turn off some of that information is interesting. Although then again, it's also kind of their choice that they've done that, and they probably don't need it. The big thing that I've seen from users who actually use Talkback is the idea of turning off speak, list, and grid information. And that is largely because list and grid information is so often shared by developers poorly. The idea that, and even from the Android operating system, the idea that like headings and things actually end up being in list by default. So for example, this here is a list of, if we're only counting the items that we can see, this is a list of 6 items. Android probably would share this as a list of 7 items and default include the heading. And that's one of those things as a developer you want to be aware of. Let's keep going through some of these features. Speak passwords, that's an interesting setting. You turn off the spoken passwords so that people listening cannot hear in on your passwords. Audio ducking, a lot of these are kind of self-explanatory. The last set of stuff that I want to talk about is the gestures. So one of the things that users are able to do is set up gestures, right? And we talked about the different on-screen gestures and the things that we can communicate. And what Talkback supplies is a list of gestures that give access to more powerful things. So for example, swipe up then down, focus the first item on the screen, right? So I do this action, I get focus on the top left arrow. It's focusing the first accessibility element on the screen, right? And there's all sorts of gestures that users can get access to. My favorites are taking users back to the home screen. A user will very frequently set up a thing that will allow them to go straight back to the home screen. These actions here, actually, so watch as I swipe right. Notice that, and this is where, notice that as I swipe right across, oh geez, how long is this? There we go. So notice when I'm here on this last thing in this list, when I swipe right, focus does not go to these controls down here, my back button, my home button, my overview button. Android does not send focus to those. Focus stays within the application content. And so when you're looking at these advanced gestures where I can do things like swipe down and left, it's going to take me back. And the reason it's going to take me back is because I don't necessarily get access to these the hardware controls as a blind user, as someone who can't see the different hardware controls. Maybe I can find my back button, maybe I get used to where it is, but I have access to that advanced gesture. And there's a couple other interesting things we can do with these gestures as well that I find developers aren't always conscious of, but that is very useful. Remember back, one of the things that I said was that as people explore content, they project their difficulties using the content onto users with disabilities. And one of my favorite examples of this is the idea of a area code, right? So I'm going to use my area code as an example. 48197 is I think one of the Ann Arbor area codes, right? So 48197. And what you'll see is developers taking a box where the number 48197 is entered, right? It's in the box, and what they'll do is they'll come in and they'll say, okay, let's set up a content description, 4 space 8 space 1 space 9 space 7, right? And what they're doing, this is a really good motivation, right? There's a really good motivation here. What they want it to do is they want Talkback to create the announcement that we have in conversation, right? That's the motivation behind this, is to say, hey, let's make sure that when we share this 48197, that Talkback actually says 48197. That's what they're trying. That's a great motivation. The reality is, though, that you've actually just slowed down the talkback speech of that. This is actually, from a blind person's point of view and how they interact with talkback, this is actually a frustrating thing. Think of it this way. What's easier to remember, 48,197 or 48197 spoken to you slowly, right? Think of the way the speech engine is going to parse this. 48,197 is a very fluid, quick announcement. 48197 is a little slower, right? And so if you picture longer numbers like bank account amounts or whatever, and you start putting spaces in between all of them to share them the way we would in speech, it's a good motivation, but it's actually fundamentally a broken idea. If a talkback user feels the need to go in and parse those one at a time, maybe because they're missing one of those numbers, or they want to explore like, what are the last two digits of that phone number, they can. Watch. So what happens is we can swipe up and down, and notice I'm going through controls, links, headings, default, right? And so what happens is I can actually go in and change the way talkback interacts with as I swipe, right? And so I left it on words, right? One of the modes, for example, is characters. Characters drives me nuts within a demo because it's difficult to show where it is. But words here, so I'm on swipe down, then up, swipe down, then up. As I swipe right across the screen, it shares these words one at a time. And so right now I'm on last. If I swipe right out again, it's going to go item. If I swipe right again, on, screen, and then swipe. See, now it's gone. It finally, after I get to the end of that whole bit of content, it will go and focus the next thing, right? And so in doing this, and then if I went up to, all right, so now let's go characters, space, R-I-G-H-T, I can actually explore my content one character at a time. And if I were on a device actually doing this, you get so that, I don't know if anyone's actually ever witnessed a blind person using one of these things, but they start swiping and moving around these contents so fast. A good friend of mine, watching him use Talkback, it's as natural consuming content this way and swiping up and down and changing the way navigation works is such a natural thing to him, that I suddenly feel bad with some of the things that I've done to essentially dumb down the content of my application in projecting my difficulties in using Talkback onto him. It's just crazy watching blind people actually interact with Talkback. Don't feel like you need to dumb down your content for people with disabilities. It's just it's fundamentally not needed. And things like this, when we hear 48197, that's a very natural way for us to consume a zip code. 48,197 is a very natural way for a blind person to consume a zip code. And you can apply that same type of thinking to users. And what I would encourage you to do is to don't project your difficulties with Talkback onto users. Actually bring in users that are using Talkback, and have them use your application, or of course a subject matter expert or something like that can also be a good bridge if you don't have access. I think sometimes I get spoiled with how much access I have to users with various disabilities and getting to work with them. It's amazing. All right, so let's talk about one more group of users, and then what I'm going to do is I think I'm going to leave the time for question and answer. So how the physically handicapped use Talkback. This one is interesting. And what we're going to see here, and the ultimate conclusion, is that Talkback is not the ideal assistive technology for someone who is physically handicapped. And what's going to happen, and I think my ultimate point here is going to be that if you're designing your content for this user, you're actually making some fundamental mistakes. So let's talk a little bit about this. A physically handicapped user will use Talkback along with a keyboard or another facilitating device. Think in terms of like joysticks. The idea of the trackball maybe on their device, they might have access to that, or perhaps a joystick that they have set up on their wheelchair. And what happens is this is going to change the game a bit. Accessibility focused navigation can be different. In fact, is almost always different. This doesn't always matter. Sometimes it's important, sometimes it's not. I'm obviously going to show you an example where it does matter. But fully supporting all Talkback users is very, very difficult. And so if you're starting to think down the lines of, okay, how can we support physically disabled users who are using Talkback, that might get to the point where you need to do some user research about how many different how many users in which various category do you have, because they're actually kind of mutually exclusive ideas here, right? And let me show you exactly what I mean. So let's go back to our calculator example, and let's clear things out. And so now notice up here, I have two focusable things here, right? I have this no formula area, and I have this results area. This results area is going to expand when I do this, but this serves as a good technical example for the issues that you can face when marking this up, right? So I've been bobbing around here with my mouse and using this the way someone would interacting with a touchscreen, right? A blind individual using the touchscreen on their device, right? But now let's go through and let's do this. And what I'm doing now is I'm going to move the mouse off screen, and I'm going to interact with this using the keyboard, right? And so notice I have this white, this kind of grayish circle following me around. And what this is this is the focus indication. This is where keyboard focus is, right? And so notice that the green Talkback rectangle is following my focus circle, right? And so basically at this point, Talkback is going to do its best to follow focus navigation. The problem is that there are things on this screen that are accessibility focusable, but not focusable, and that is absolutely correct. One of the things that I see on a lot of forums, and actually this is sent down sometimes from Google engineers, is that in order to make something accessible by Talkback, you need to mark it as focusable. That is absolutely false. If you do that, what happens is you end up so picture tabbing around a paragraph content in like a web page or something, right? And having keyboard focus go onto a paragraph of text. That there's going to be no indication that that's what has happened, and there's no real functionable reason for that to happen, right? The only reason that any type of focus would ever need to be on text would be to share that text, and screen readers are in charge of that interaction, not the actual focus. And that's the distinction between focus and accessibility focus. Focus needs to go on interactive controls of an application. Accessibility focus is the thing that adds to informative controls. And sometimes those are one and the same, right? For our calculator numbers here, focus and accessibility focus should be in the same spot. We need to understand what this content is, and we need to interact with it, right? But now, notice as I arrow up that this thing here that was here, right? So what I'm doing is I'm hitting the up arrow right now, up and down arrow. Notice that we are skipping a significant section of content, right? So my accessibility focus and my Talkback focus, my Talkback focus and my the interactive focus, right? That keyboard focus, the thing, it doesn't need to go here. There's no interactive thing here, right? And so if we go in and look at the screenshot, so this is going to be a screenshot with some accessibility information for us. Notice here, important for accessibility equals true, class equals Talkback. Notice here, clickable equals false, focusable equals false on some of this information, right? So we have some information here that is not clickable and not focusable. And that is why we are skipping over that content when we're doing this kind of keyboard navigation mode, because this content here is not focusable. I believe that is the way it should be. It doesn't really make sense to have keyboard focus, input focus, go into a thing that doesn't have any interaction capability. That's not really what focus means. But it's just kind of an interesting thing when you're talking about the design, the usability of your application. You want to make sure that you properly track the difference between input focus and accessibility focus, and that you don't munge those two things together. And ultimately, the conclusion that we come to is that Talkback probably isn't the ideal assistive technology for someone who is physically handicapped. You can't serve both masters, and when you're looking at the audience that is Talkback and having empathy for that audience, it really is primarily the blind audience that is going to be the consumer of that blind and partially sighted audience. And you want to make the user experience as good for them as possible. And when you're talking about keyboard focus and the idea of putting input focus onto purely informative elements, it just doesn't fundamentally make sense when you're talking about users that don't have any issue seeing and how they are going to interact with your content with the keyboard. You can't serve both individuals. So I think I'm going to end there and open it up if anyone should have questions. I saw a lot of chat notifications pop up, and I think I will take questions and discussion now.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris. That was a lot of really good information on gestures and good design practices for Talkback and accessibility. So I'm just going to start off with some questions. So Darren asks, is there a list of websites and/or mobile apps that have a great web accessibility and screen reading capabilities? That way some of us can do research and investigation on how to build our own website and applications.
Yeah, so there are a few different resources I would recommend. Facebook has a lot of really great accessibility engineers. I haven't done an accessibility analysis of their application myself in a good while, but I know that they I've been to some presentations from their accessibility engineers and been really impressed. I also in a group with some Google Plus engineers. I would recommend checking out Google Plus. They tend to just open here. They tend to utilize a lot of the new APIs and use their stuff as kind of a demo for some new best practices. And so what you're going to see is if you have some older devices, you may run into trouble interacting with their applications from an accessibility point of view because they use that as kind of a demo ground for some of their new APIs. So I would recommend going there with if you're going to use Google Plus as a good example, go there with an 8.0 device at least. Otherwise, you're gonna get some older behaviors that aren't as good. We also have Deque University for Android and Deque University for iOS GitHub applications. Those are also a great place to go. In fact, we have a major update coming to those in the near future.
Great. So Ken asks, how would a Talkback or AT user navigate a large data table, for example, a size chart with 10 or more columns? Is it primarily via swipe gestures rather than dragging to explore?
Yeah, so when you're talking about navigating through significantly complex content, the tendency, even for partially sighted users, is going to be to use swipe to explore. What happens is I don't know, I fat finger things on my phone all the time, and so if you can picture going around, let's say this calculator, right? And let's say that I had a small device and I was going through this with my thumb. It just the idea of going across rows and accidentally, let's say that I'm touched to exploring a hypothetical table here, and I fat finger it, and I think I'm on the 8 when I'm on the 5 in that row, right? And it just doesn't work. And so what happens is you're going to tend to get users. We're kind of exploring the content for the row that we want, and then they're going to tend to swipe through that row for the cells of information. That's going to be the way, the kind of best experience if you have a lot of rows, or if you have a lot of columns, right? So they're going to explore for the header of the row that they want, and then they're going to swipe right until they get to the column of information that they want. That's going to tend to be the best user experience. And so when you're building up your data tables, think about that user experience and think, okay, so we want to communicate and make sure it's clear what row that they're on to the left that way, and then communicate the column interactions as they're swiping to the right.
Got it. So when people are developing their mobile apps, do you recommend testing for functionality first and then for navigation?
That is a really good question. I would actually tend to think that navigation is something that matters more from a design perspective. When you're talking about implementing navigation, and actually I ran across this when I was using this calculator application here. No, actually it was the settings. Let me go, this is actually really interesting. So let's go to the accessibility settings. This is where we would actually turn Talkback on, right? And so when you look at this, you see something from a design perspective that should be essentially trivial to get right from an implementation perspective when we're talking navigation, right? We have two controls on this page, and it should be very trivial to get this correct. And watch what happens. So I'm going to avoid my mouse, and I'm going to do some keyboard navigation here. Notice the very first thing that happens is I go straight from use service. I skip over the switch that turns Talkback off, and I go right down to settings. Sorry, I had my mouse over it this time, but the implementation here is wrong, right? And so from a design perspective, they got this right. There's only a couple things here. It's very simple. As I arrow around, look, I even skipped straight down. When I hit the down arrow, I skipped straight down to the content, right? And so what you want to do is don't muck with it. What they've done here, and actually because the standard focus order here in a well-designed application is going to be such that, in fact, if I turned Talkback off and didn't allow my controls to do anything, the navigation order absolutely would be tab, tab, tab. Again, this isn't going to be focusable because it's content, but the Talkback and the implementation is actually the thing that's mucking with this, right? That's the problem here. They would have been better off not doing anything when it comes to focus order, because not doing anything is going to calculate focus order based on the X and Y coordinates, and the X and Y coordinates here are correct, right? Looking at X and Y here, we're going to focus this, then we're going to focus this, then we're going to focus this, and that's just the way it's going to be, right? As I tab around here, I'm skipping things, right? I can get different behaviors as I hit tab based on where I start. Here, I'm in this kind of endless loop where I can't get up. I'm just hitting tab right now, by the way. I'm in this endless loop where I can't get up to the back arrow, right? And so what's best? The best thing to do is to design your content streamlined in a way where the X and Y navigation matches what you see on screen, and then don't implement focus ordering at all. Just let the operating system do it. You can only get yourself into trouble by doing that. If you do have to do it, I would recommend doing it last.
Great. Quick question here from Mark. He asked, does Talkback have a grayscale feature to test for color contrast?
Does Talkback have a grayscale feature to test for color contrast? No, it does not. There are other accessibility settings within the operating system to facilitate color contrast usability. For example, you can do like let's change it so that you like invert colors and things like that. But the best color contrast check available is going to be within the Attest for Android Deque product. We do automated accessibility, including color contrast. That's going to be your best option.
Great. Gail asks, do you know of any way to navigate to select and copy static text in a mobile web page for pasting elsewhere, such as a form field when using Talkback? Also, is there a way to do that in a properly made accessible native app?
I am gonna need clarification on that question, because I feel like I will interpret it wrong way. I feel like for the asker, I feel like that was just a fundamental question about how do you copy and paste things in Talkback.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that is incorrect, please clarify. But let's wait for clarification on that one and go to the next one.
Okay. So Aiden asked, how accurate is the emulator for testing? Does it give a fairly reliable result compared to a real device?
Emulators and real devices are essentially identical in the Android world. The difference between testing for Talkback on the device and testing for Talkback on the emulator is you're going to have to grab onto the APK and install it on the emulator, which for me almost inevitably means I don't really like grabbing APKs off devices and then installing them on emulators. So what I do is I use the open source Talkback repository. And this is really nice for two reasons. A, it gives you access to debugging information about Talkback. You can put things like breakpoints and figure out why Talkback is doing what it's doing. The downsides are their open source repository crawls significantly behind their releases, sometimes by a couple months, and so you don't always have access to the newest and greatest things, although nor do your customers. So for me, that's actually a plus, to be honest. I don't like necessarily being on the latest and greatest because it's not very often that my customers are on the latest and greatest. If you look at the Talkback and Android metrics and all those things for that, most of the population is going to be one full version of things behind, and 2 to 3 months is certainly within that one full version. So if you want to get the experience of the bulk of your users, what you will do is you will stay roughly 6 months behind of whatever the Android release flow, and that's going to catch about 30% of the audience. The other 10% stay on new stuff, and then that other 60% roughly is in some kind of random thing between stuff they've released 2 years ago and stuff they've released 50 years ago, right? And they're all spread out in there. But the best thing to stay on, as far as if you're trying to get simple coverage of accessibility quickly, I would recommend the following. And actually, I had a slide about this later on, but when you're talking about getting good accessibility coverage, what I recommend is a Pixel or purely Google device, a Samsung device. You're gonna see a lot of differences between those two things, and then testing with the following combinations of assistive technologies: a Talkback. Purely Talkback in that kind of touch to explore and blind user mode, and then also with a keyboard, Talkback with a keyboard. And then what you're looking for with that Talkback with the keyboard is that all of the active controls are focused. And then what that's going to do is that's going to get you good coverage for a lot of different disabilities. It's going to get you good coverage for your Talkback users. It's going to get you good device coverage in that a lot of the things that Samsung gets wrong about the accessibility APIs, HTC and some other third party the companies that create their own flavor of Android, Samsung, HTC, and some other companies get the same things wrong about accessibility. So by testing Google and Samsung, you're covering actually a lot of other different operating system vendors as well. And so basically, when you're testing within an emulator, what you have covered is essentially the stock Google experience. So for example, if you were going to do an Android and a Google device, your Android device could be your emulator, and your Samsung device could be a Galaxy S5 or something like that, right? And so that basically the emulator, the thing to note about the emulator there is that the emulator is going to be closest to the stock Google experience. And so if you're testing on an emulator and a Pixel, you are testing no additional thing, right? So what I would recommend then is test on an emulator and a Samsung device, and then you're doing good stuff.
Great. So Janet asks, what are some common examples where developer difficulties disagree with user difficulties?
So there's actually, there's a laundry list of them. In fact, I've been interacting with people with disabilities and watching them use Talkback, and I'm always amazed at how fluent they are in using these things. But some of my personal favorites. And I actually have developers look at this one. First of all, the number thing, right? The idea that separating numbers and zip codes and adding spaces to things, that it's just not a problem. Another thing is developers tend to want to parse content into different paragraphs for users. That they get concerned with how much information they're sharing. So for example, when I focus this one big blob of text here, I once had a developer come in, and this is probably a small example. I think you could extend this down even a full page, right? And so the idea that why are we sharing all of this content in one focusable box? And developers so the bad thing to do would be to split these two things into two individual focusable boxes. It's just not needed. And there's all sorts of reasons it's not needed. As a Talkback user, what's going to happen is they're going to turn up the speech rate on this. So when notice that that toast stayed up here for, oh geez, what was it, like 45 seconds, right? Which means it would take the text to speech engine roughly 45 seconds to read that. A talkback user is going to turn up the speech rate to about 300 or 400%, and it's going to fly through this amount of content in about 5 to 10 seconds. And so it's just the speech rate, that their ability to consume spoken information is just something that we cannot comprehend. And I don't even try to I had one of my friends give me their headphones once. They always listen to Talkback through headphones, and he shared his headphones with me, and I was like, I can't even understand a single word that it's saying. And he's just consuming complicated data tables at that rate. It's crazy. Another reason for that is if they want to chunk this content up, you can't forget that they have characters, words mode, lines mode, paragraphs mode. They have access to all those things, and they fly around and use it. There's a lot of other kind of scenarios. The idea of it's grouping of information, the idea of how information is grouped. There's actually one of the things that I think the converse of that statement, things that developers don't see a big issue with, but that Talkback users have a problem with. For example, on switch out of list. That's a very confusing statement if you're blind and using this control, right? On switch out of list. What list? There is no list here, right? On switch for what, right? And so as developers, there's data association in here that is lost, right? And so the idea, remember back here how we talked about overly grouping information. Overly grouping things is actually good, right? Associating information. So for example, this little eye thing out here, while I agree that this eye thing, this eye image here, is not informative and doesn't convey any more useful information, it is still there. It's still part of the page. Why isn't this green focus rectangle encompassing that thing so that we say, hey, attention, there's information here. Oh, by the way, this paragraph to the right is that information that we're sharing, right? And so if we were to just extend this green rectangle out over here, it's not a significant improvement for this particular view because that eye is so meaningless. But if you're in a situation where, for example, you have, like, imagine here if we were to focus the calculator icon and the calculator text separately, that would be absurd. It just doesn't fundamentally make sense. And that, I think, now, that being said, that doesn't mean we should just focus the calculator text. These two things are grouped together. They work together to convey that information. And so that's something that I think the converse of that developers miss that is important. And there's a bunch of other lists in my head that I can't come up with right now. But I think if you understand the motivation of that, call them out. And the best way to experience that, honestly, is to get someone who is blind to actually use your application and watch the difficulties that they have.
Great, thanks, Chris. So it's now 2 p.m. We've run out of time, but don't worry, if you had a pending question that we didn't get to, I'll be sure to organize those and send those to Chris so he can respond to you via email. Also, just a friendly reminder again that this is recorded, and we will be sending the recording and slides out in an email later this week. So thanks again for everyone who attended this webinar, and thanks to Chris for doing a great job. Join some of our webinars in the future soon. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.